Good morning. Welcome to OMGT 5013 Supply Chain Management for Operations Managers. And this class seeks to explore the relationship and also to explore the function of supply chain as it relates to operations management, which we find is a complex relationship, but also a customer and supplier relationship if we look at the fact that supply chain is actually, or operations is actually a functional customer of the supply chain process. So with that being said, perhaps the first place to start to understand this relationship is to look at the concept of value. And value is an issue of perception, and it's an issue of perception where one party looks at how value is perceived from those that are supplying a particular good or service to another party that perceives that it has an intrinsic value. And this is critical, again, when we look at the relationship of how supply chain relates to operations. Now, in particular, in the field of operations, we look at value in the area of an operational input. For example, a material or a service or some other type of tangible or perhaps intangible activity that is supplied into the operations process to allow the operations to create an output that again goes to the final customer. So again, if we look at this relationship, or you look at this image of value as it pertains to operations, you can see to a degree how supply chain can become actually a functional supplier to the operations activity, and that operations can be a further downstream customer of the supply chain process. And again, by looking at it purely from a perception of value. That being said, that leads us into how we look at supply chain as a supplier of value to the operations. And again, this is particularly critical when we look at supply chain as an overall function or overall element of the operations process. So, that being said, the next activity we would need to look at is how supply chain relates to the overall stakeholder process. And again, if we look here, we can see that the operations is at the core of the stakeholder process, but that there are many stakeholders that surround the operations activities, from suppliers to shareholders to community, employees, government, and customers. So there's a broad relationship of stakeholders that relate to the operational process. Looking at the supply chain relationship and how the supply chain affects the operational stakeholder relationship, we can see that from many different angles and many different activities, such as the inputs that come into the business from a supply chain activity, suppliers will be supplying inputs such as materials or service. Shareholders benefit from the supply chain relationship from the profits and innovations that are generated from the supply chain input into the operational outputs. We see that the community benefits from jobs and tax and revenue that the supply chain process adds to the overall operations function. And we see that employees benefit from the manufacturing inputs or manufacturing outputs that come directly from the supply chain inputs, and then also from areas of the supply chain process such as the materials management function. And that's one of the core elements that really affect the operational process. Governments are impacted by tax revenues that are supplied as a direct result of the supply chain process. And finally, customers benefit from the supply chain relationship with operations in terms of cost, delivery, quality, and design. So you can see that the supply chain process is very tangential to the overall success of the overall operational activities. So, again, looking at our concept of value as it relates to the supply chain process, we see the value chain. And for you, this may be, especially MBA candidates, you will notice that this refers to Porter's activity as he looks at the value chain and how the operation or the organization creates actual competitive benefit. You'll notice in the value chain there's inbound logistics that affect the operation, come into the operations process, that are transformed into outbound activities, such as logistics, into marketing and sales, and into service. But if we look at the supply chain process overall of how it affects the value chain of an operation, you can see that in almost every one of these areas, there is some element of the supply chain process. For example, inbound logistics, look at the freight coming in, warehousing, supplier service, again, all of the functional inputs that come into the operations process. In the operations, supply chain impacts this from the standpoint of materials management within the operations itself, the warehousing process, enterprise resource planning, outbound logistics as part of the value chain. You can see again where the supply chain process affects this from a freight standpoint of logistics, warehousing, again, enterprise resource management. Marketing and sales are affected by freight, warehousing, and distribution. And then also service can be affected by warehouse and distribution. So you can see that the supply chain process is very elemental as well as incremental to the overall operations process and becomes a key and critical role. So again, in summary, just as an overall concept, the supply chain is a core element of the overall operations activity. And if we put in the context of value, you will find that supply chain is also one of the key drivers and key value adders to the operations process, and provides the majority of the inputs that are consumed within the operations process, whether it be a service operation, whether it be a manufacturing operation, and becomes a core element of the overall manufacturing or operation strategy that's developed. So again, broad general concepts, as we will get into and we'll study as we go through this course, many of the key elements that comprise the supply chain. But it suffices to say the supply chain starts at the beginning of the process and goes all the way through the process and is a core element of the overall operations activity. So I look forward to learning this with you.